my name is Guðmundur Steinn Gunnarsson, and I'm a composer, born and raised in Reykjavík. And I have been working with the haldorophone occasionally for a few years, and I met Halldor in 2003 and witnessed the haldorophone in its embryonic stages. But it wasn't until 2011 or so that this instrument started to enter into a collective that I've been part of called Slaughter, which is a collective of experimental composers in Reykjavík. And a lot of us were interested in experimental instruments, experimental notation, and so on. But like a lot of composers, I'm not very skilled with carpentry or such things, so it was very nice to encounter Halldor in this context. And he made this instrument, and there's been a lot of people using it, both composers in Iceland and abroad, but also people in various different styles of music have found use for it in different ways. For instance, I would prefer to use it in a more acoustic setting, blending with instruments, blending in a space. Other people find it more useful to connect it to computers and effects. But I like it very much sort of as is, with these faders, and this is no extra gadgets, no extra effects or anything. This is the haldorophone, and this is essentially like a cello, but with integrated feedback mechanism, a speaker and pickups that feed back into the instrument. So you have, I can both play it like this, or with a bow, or I can play it like this. And I have a knob for, or a fader for each of the strings. And a master volume, which I also control here with a pedal, but you can use it without a pedal or with a pedal. And the fifth fader is actually sympathetic resonating strings that have their own tuning heads here, and you can see that they're here behind. So it's like similar to the Norwegian hardanger fiddle, but also a lot of instruments from India, such as the sitar or the veena or some other instruments. But you can pretty much, you can turn each of the faders up and down and play the instrument without actually attacking the string either with a pluck or a bow. Technically, the feedback itself can sort of start the note. So you have all kinds of things that you can do. Because one of the things that you cannot do on a traditional string instrument is to have the strings interact in the way that this does, because all of a sudden you have a system where everything affects everything else. And if I just put a lot of these up, you never know which one is going to be the first, what's going to be the first note to enter. And there's always, there can be a new partial or new note that kind of becomes more dominant in the context, and it affects the whole system in a way. So it's very organic in a sense, because the sympathetic resonance, the first haldorophones that I worked with in some of my pieces, they didn't have the sympathetic resonance strings, and you can play it without them entirely, but they add a very interesting thing to the mix, because the idea of sympathetic resonating strings, like on the hardanger violin, is basically like a reverb. You play a certain note and it resonates a little bit after it's stopped, because it's a sympathetic resonance. String is tuned in some kind of a harmonic partial that without touching, one makes the other resonate, and that's the same kind of thing, whereas the resonance doesn't stop. It just keeps going, and everything can affect everything else, and it can quickly get out of control, so to speak. But I think it's an instrument like any other. You learn how to work with it. You give it a little bit of time to get into the kind of flavors that you want to work with, and it has. You can recall things that you tried before if you know how. It's just the control is a little bit. You're going to get approximately there in a sense, because the as I say, feedback, it's like fire. You can't really control it completely. You can make the conditions for it to arise, and you can try to sustain those conditions and have different feedbacks interacting with each other. And of course, this is always just one feedback, because it's always going through this one speaker. So it's never 4 or 8 separate feedbacks. It's 4 or 8 separate strings feeding into the same overall system. Any instrument is basically, if you think about it from a computer digital perspective, every single classical acoustical instrument, $1 million Stradivarius or whatever, if you compare it with something like this, what it basically is that it's a really, really, really bad speaker, because it has a very, very limited frequency range and a very kind of fixed way of sounding. And I think that, if you would put too many speakers and you spread them out, you have something completely different. What I like about this instrument is that it's all contained, and that it's all interacting, everything interacts with everything else in a very local context. To play with feedback, you're playing with high volume, high intensity. But here, everything is optimized to, I'm with my speaking voice, I'm with my indoor voice, and I'm playing with feedback at the same time, which is pretty remarkable, I think. I've written 2 or 3 pieces with a haldorophone and collaborated in lots of experiments and improvisations. But I wrote one solo piece for haldorophone and for a Finnish cellist called Markus Hotti, who played it. And the notation, the way I wrote it, I think it can be performed on any haldorophone, given that the person is already familiar with the instrument. So I think it translates, even though some things are always going to be different. I think it's like with any other instrument. And I think, especially coming from the classical background, we tend to think of instruments as really fixed, like a preset on a MIDI keyboard or something. But if you go more than 100 years back, this is not always the case. And for instance, Johann Sebastian Bach, he wrote the 6th cello suite for an instrument that doesn't exist anymore, which is supposedly some kind of 5-string cello. And that's a kind of risk that most composers today don't take, because they want everything to be like a mail order thing. You pick one of these, 2 of these, 3 of these, send it to anywhere in the world and get exactly the same results. And that's just kind of a little bit pointless in an era when you can create any kind of sound in a computer. There has to be, if you want to work with scores, there has to be, yeah, it's like working with theater once film's been invented. There has to be something that can change from one occasion to the other and still retain some kind of an essence, I think. And I think the haldorophone is capable, the different instruments, even though they're very varied, there's still some kind of an essence. It's all, I feel like even from the embryonic stages, it's still the same instrument. And it's been almost 20 years.